The silence came first. Not the polite kind. Not the ceremonial kind. The kind that makes you realize something has already happened, and you're just late to the realization. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the story you were told for years was never the real one? What if the fairy tale ending didn't collapse overnight, but cracked slowly, quietly, behind smiles, interviews, and perfectly timed headlines? Because here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. If everything was exactly as we were told, why does it feel like the ground shifted before anyone announced the earthquake? For a long time, the world was trained to see this story in extremes. Love or hate, hero or villain, victim or aggressor. A modern romance fighting ancient institutions. A prince choosing love over duty. A woman breaking barriers. A couple rewriting the rules. That version was clean, cinematic, easy to digest. But real life is rarely that tidy. And sometimes, the most dangerous stories aren't the ones filled with shouting and chaos. They're the ones built on consistency, repetition, carefully chosen words. Stories told so many times they start to feel like memory instead of narrative. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw Prince Harry genuinely relaxed? Not smiling for a camera. Not delivering a practice line. Not sitting across from an interviewer who already knew the answers. Relaxed. Because people close to this story, the ones who don't speak in headlines, say the shift didn't come with a bang. It came with hesitation. With pauses mid-sentence. With glances that lingered too long. With a man who started asking quieter questions instead of louder ones. And that's where this story really begins. Not with divorce papers. Not with accusations. Not with tabloid shockwaves. It begins with doubt. Doubt is a dangerous thing when you've built your life around certainty. When your identity, your choices, your sacrifices are tied to a shared version of events. When questioning the story means questioning yourself. For years, Harry stood by a single narrative. Defended it. Repeated it. Took hits for it. Lost relationships for it. Walked away from everything he'd ever known for it. So what changes a man like that? It's easy to imagine betrayal as explosive. A dramatic reveal. A smoking gun. A confession overheard through a door. But often, betrayal arrives disguised as inconsistency. A timeline that doesn't quite line up. A detail that shifts depending on the audience. An emotional reaction that feels rehearsed instead of raw. At first, you brush it off. Everyone misspeaks. Everyone remembers things differently. Trauma is complicated. Public life distorts memory, right? Except, what happens when it keeps happening? What happens when the contradictions don't disappear, but multiply? What happens when you realize you're working harder to defend the story than to live inside it? This isn't about proving guilt. It's not about declaring innocence. And it's certainly not about reducing a marriage to a headline. It's about understanding how narratives are built and how they collapse. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. You don't wake up one day and decide your partner lied to you. That realization creeps in. It shows up in the moments when you replay a conversation in your head and realize the answer didn't actually answer the question. When you notice how often you're being asked to remember things correctly. When defending someone starts to feel like explaining away your own instincts. And when you're isolated, truly isolated, those instincts get louder. Harry's isolation has been discussed endlessly, but rarely examined deeply. Was it circumstantial, intentional, self-inflicted, or something more subtle? Because isolation doesn't always look like being alone. Sometimes it looks like being surrounded by people who all agree with the same version of reality. And once that version becomes your oxygen, questioning it feels like suffocation. For a long time, Harry didn't question. Or if he did, he buried it. Loyalty can do that. Love definitely can. And when the entire world frames your relationship as a moral stand, walking away doesn't just feel personal. It feels ideological. You're not just leaving a person. You're leaving a cause. So why now? Why does it suddenly feel like something snapped? Observers started noticing it before any announcement. A change in tone. Less certainty. More defensiveness. Less fire. More fatigue. Interviews that felt heavier. Statements that felt carefully emptied of emotion. And behind the scenes, according to those familiar with the situation, conversations were changing. Not arguments. Not shouting matches. Questions. Simple ones. Why did this detail change? Why does this story sound different this time? Why wasn't I told that before? Questions that don't accuse, but also don't let go. And here's where things get uncomfortable for everyone watching from the outside. Because when a relationship is built on shared opposition against a family, an institution, a media system, the moment you start questioning your partner's version of events, you're no longer on the same side of the barricade. You're suddenly the threat. And threats don't get clarity. They get control. That's when narratives tighten. That's when emotional language intensifies. That's when past sacrifices are brought up as proof of loyalty. Remember what we gave up. Remember what we lost. Remember who hurt us. Those phrases can unite or trap. So imagine being Harry in that position. A man whose entire public reinvention was tied to believing one story completely. A man who defended it so fiercely that reversing course wouldn't just embarrass him. It would unravel years of decisions. Would you want to see the truth right away? Or would you hesitate? Most people hesitate. Because accepting that you may have been misled doesn't just change your future. It rewrites your past. And that rewrite is brutal. It forces you to ask whether your anger was always yours or borrowed. Whether your estrangement was inevitable or engineered. Whether the pain you carried was real or amplified to keep you aligned. This is why the alleged turning point matters so much. Not because of what was said publicly, but because of what was allegedly said privately. A moment when the story didn't match the emotion. When the reaction didn't match the reality. When the explanation felt practiced instead of spontaneous. And in that moment, according to sources who claim insight into Harry's thinking, a terrifying possibility surfaced. What if the problem wasn't the world misunderstanding them? What if the problem was him misunderstanding her? That question alone can end a marriage. Not immediately, not loudly, but decisively. Because once trust fractures at the narrative level, not just emotionally, but factually, everything becomes suspect. Every memory, every shared grievance, every sacrifice. And here's the part no one prepares you for. You don't stop loving someone just because you start doubting them. Love lingers. Hope lingers. Denial lingers. Which is why the period leading up to the rumored divorce wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, claustrophobic. A slow realization that something foundational was wrong. People close to Harry describe a man who wasn't angry at first. He was confused. Confusion is far more dangerous than rage. Because rage can be directed outward. Confusion turns inward. It asks, how did I miss this? Why didn't I question sooner? What else don't I know? And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Especially when the inconsistencies keep coming. Because what came next wasn't a single revelation, it was a pattern. A pattern that stretched backward through interviews, timelines, and emotional appeals. A pattern that forced Harry to confront something even more painful than betrayal. The possibility that the story he fought for so hard was never as solid as he believed. And if that's true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If the narrative wasn't true, what else wasn't? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the version of the love story you were sold was never meant to be questioned? That's the uncomfortable thought that sits right at the center of everything that followed. Because once doubt enters the room, it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't knock. It rearranges the furniture while you're still pretending nothing's changed. This is where we pick up. Right after that first realization. Right after the idea forms that maybe the narrative itself is the problem. For years, the public romance between Harry and Meghan was presented as something almost mythic. A modern prince breaking free. A woman stepping into history and challenging it. Two people against the world. If you questioned it, you were accused of bitterness. If you analyzed it, you were labeled cruel. If you hesitated, you were told you just didn't understand love. But here's the thing about stories that are too perfect. They demand belief, not scrutiny. And scrutiny is exactly what began to happen. Not from the press at first. Not from critics. From inside the relationship. The shift didn't start with confrontation. It started with observation. Harry noticing how often he was repeating phrases that didn't feel like his own. How frequently he was defending details he hadn't personally experienced. How the emotional weight of certain grievances seemed heavier in interviews than in private. Have you ever defended a story so many times that you stopped asking whether it was yours? That's the trap. Once you take on someone else's narrative as your own, disentangling it feels like betrayal. Not just of them, but of yourself. At first, the inconsistencies were small. barely noticeable, dates that felt fuzzy, recollections that changed slightly depending on the setting, emotional reactions that didn't always align with the gravity of the moment being described. Normal, right? Except it kept happening. And what makes this story so compelling isn't that contradictions existed. It's that they were explained away with absolute confidence. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just certainty stacked on top of certainty. That's persuasive, especially when you're already emotionally invested. Harry had spent most of his life being told what his role was. Spare, support, smile, step back. For once, he had something that felt like purpose, a mission, a shared cause, and that cause came with a story that needed protecting. So he protected it. He repeated it. He sharpened it. He took hits for it. He allowed bridges to burn because he believed the fire had a reason. But belief is fragile when it's built on borrowed memory. Slowly, moments began to surface that didn't fit the script. Conversations that felt rehearsed in advance. Emotional appeals that arrived precisely when doubt appeared. Situations where Harry's own lived experience didn't quite match the explanation he was expected to give. Ask yourself this. How many times can someone tell you how to feel before you stop trusting your own instincts? That's where tension began to build. Not dramatic tension, psychological tension. The kind that keeps you awake at night replaying conversations. The kind that makes you question whether you're being unfair, ungrateful, or disloyal for even thinking these thoughts. Because the public version of their relationship left no room for nuance. There was good and evil, supporters and enemies, victims and aggressors. Where did that leave a husband who simply wanted clarity? Every time Harry tried to slow the narrative down, it accelerated. Every time he asked for details, the focus shifted to emotion. Pain replaced precision. Trauma replaced timelines. And trauma is powerful. It demands belief. But here's the contradiction that started to matter. Trauma doesn't require consistency. Stories do. When you're telling the truth as you remember it, uncertainty is natural. When you're maintaining a narrative, certainty is strategic. That difference became impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, Harry's role increasingly became that of a defender rather than a partner. He wasn't just supporting his wife. He was safeguarding the story that justified every choice they made. And that's exhausting. Imagine carrying not just your own emotions, but someone else's unresolved conflicts with an entire institution. Imagine being told, implicitly or explicitly, that questioning the story means siding with the enemy. Because once doubt equals disloyalty, communication collapses. This is where the isolation deepened. Harry wasn't isolated in the sense of being alone. He was isolated in the sense of being surrounded only by perspectives that reinforced a single version of reality. Old friends were distant. Family relationships were strained. Advisors were filtered. Critics were dismissed wholesale. The echo chamber wasn't accidental. It was protective, but protection can become pressure. And pressure eventually forces cracks to the surface. There were moments, according to people who observed closely, where Harry would pause mid-sentence in interviews, where his tone would flatten, where his eyes would search for something off-camera before continuing. Those moments were subtle. Most viewers miss them, but once you see them, you can't unsee them. They're the moments when someone is remembering what they're supposed to say instead of what they actually feel. And that's when the internal conflict sharpened. Harry began to realize that the public narrative left no room for his own evolving perspective. He was locked into a position that required emotional escalation even as his private doubts grew. That disconnect is dangerous, because when you're forced to perform certainty while experiencing confusion, something eventually gives. What gave first wasn't the marriage. It was the illusion of unity. Small disagreements surfaced, not about love, but about messaging, about what to say, about how much to reveal, about whether certain claims needed clarification or expansion. Each disagreement was framed as a test of loyalty. Do you believe me, or don't you? That question is a relationship killer, because it replaces trust with ultimatum. And here's where the public love story begins to look very different under the surface. Harry wasn't questioning her feelings. He was questioning the structure of the story built around those feelings. The way events were framed, the way motivations were assigned, the way blame was distributed with surgical precision. The more he questioned, the more the narrative tightened. Emotion intensified, language sharpened, Past sacrifices were reintroduced as evidence that doubt was unacceptable. Remember what we went through. Remember who hurt us. Remember why we left. Those reminders are powerful. They work. They kept Harry aligned for a long time. But alignment isn't the same as agreement. And once that distinction becomes clear, everything shifts. Behind the scenes, Harry reportedly began to seek outside perspective. Quietly, carefully, not to undermine his marriage, but to sanity check his own perceptions. Was he overthinking? Was this normal? Was doubt a sign of weakness or awareness? Those conversations didn't provide answers. They provided something more dangerous. Options. Because once you realize you're allowed to question, you can't unknow it. The public still saw a united front. Interviews continued. Statements were released. The story remained intact. But privately, Harry was wrestling with something far more destabilizing than disagreement. He was confronting the possibility that the story he defended wasn't simply incomplete. It might have been constructed. That realization doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives with nausea, with guilt, with fear. Because if the narrative was constructed, then the anger he felt toward others may have been redirected. The estrangement from his family may have been accelerated. The sacrifices he made may not have been inevitable. And that's devastating. It forces you to ask whether love was used as leverage, whether pain was amplified for effect, whether your loyalty was earned or assumed. This is why the question at the heart of this chapter matters so much. What if the public love story wasn't false, but curated? What if the truth existed, but only in pieces, arranged to serve a purpose? And what happens to a marriage when one partner starts rearranging those pieces on their own? Harry didn't confront everything at once. He couldn't. Doing so would have meant admitting that years of certainty might have been misplaced. Instead, he started with small tests. Asking for clarification, revisiting timelines, comparing versions of events. Each time, the response was emotional rather than factual, hurt rather than explanation, defensiveness rather than dialogue. That pattern matters. Because healthy relationships allow questions without punishment. When questions trigger guilt, something is wrong. And slowly, Harry began to understand that the story he thought they shared might not belong to both of them equally. It might belong to one person, with the other cast as its most loyal witness. That realization didn't end the marriage, but it changed it forever. Because from that moment on, every interview sounded different. Every statement felt heavier. Every silence spoke louder than the words around it. And the more Harry noticed the pattern, the more he realized something chilling. If the story could shift depending on the audience, if the details could evolve without acknowledgement, if emotional intensity could override factual clarity, then the problem wasn't the press. It wasn't the palace. It wasn't even the public. The problem was that the foundation of the story itself was unstable. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. But what Harry uncovered next wasn't just inconsistency. It was something far more personal. Something that forced him to confront not just the narrative, but the nature of trust itself. And that's where the real fracture began. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when doubt stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal? Because there's a moment, subtle but irreversible, when suspicion shifts from the story to the storyteller. When you're no longer asking whether the narrative holds up, but whether the person delivering it believes it the same way you do. That's where Harry found himself next. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It wasn't about interviews or public opinion or even family conflict. It was about trust at its most basic level. The kind of trust that lives in private conversations, late at night, when there's no audience to persuade. And that's exactly why this stage of the story was so dangerous. Up until now, Harry could still tell himself he was overthinking. That stress was distorting perception. That public pressure was making everything feel heavier than it really was. But then came the moments that didn't make sense even in private. Small things at first. Casual remarks that contradicted earlier explanations. Emotional reactions that seemed calibrated rather than spontaneous. A growing pattern where questions were met with offense instead of clarification. Have you ever asked someone you love a genuine question and felt like you'd committed a crime? That feeling doesn't appear out of nowhere. It appears when communication turns into negotiation. When every conversation has stakes. When understanding becomes secondary to alignment. Harry began noticing how often his role in private discussions mirrored his role in public ones. not as a collaborator, but as a supporter, a validator, a witness whose job was to affirm rather than explore. At first, he tried to adjust, tried to be more careful with his words, tried to soften his questions, tried to reassure before asking anything that could be interpreted as doubt. But reassurance became a prerequisite, and that's when something inside him shifted. Because reassurance before truth is a form of control. The more Harry tried to clarify, the more emotional the responses became. Hurt, tears, references to past pain, reminders of everything that had already been sacrificed. And those sacrifices were real. That's what made it so complicated. Love was real. Pain was real. The hostility they faced was real. But the framing of every disagreement as a moral failure on Harry's part was not. If you love me, why are you questioning this? If you trust me, why do you need details? If you're on my side, why does this matter? Those questions sound reasonable on the surface. They're emotionally persuasive. They make you feel selfish for wanting clarity. But they also shut down conversation. And slowly, Harry began to realize something unsettling. He wasn't allowed to process events independently. Every interpretation had to align. Every memory had to match. Every emotional response had to be synchronized. That's not partnership. That's narrative enforcement. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Publicly, the story was about finding one's voice. Privately, Harry felt like his own voice was shrinking. And here's where the irony cuts deepest. This was the man who had left everything behind to escape control, who had spoken openly about trauma, autonomy, and mental health, who had framed his choices as a fight for freedom. Yet in his most intimate relationship, he was beginning to feel constrained in ways he couldn't articulate without triggering conflict. That realization doesn't come with anger. It comes with grief. Because grief is what you feel when the thing you believed in starts slipping through your fingers. Harry didn't want to be right. He wanted to be wrong. He wanted the doubt to disappear so the story could settle back into place. But the doubt didn't disappear. It evolved. It became pattern recognition. He started replaying past moments with new awareness. Conversations that once felt passionate now felt scripted. Conflicts that once felt justified now felt rehearsed. Not fake, but framed. And framing matters. Because when someone frames events for you, they're guiding not just your understanding, but your emotions. They're telling you where to direct anger, where to assign blame, where to locate loyalty. That power is subtle and incredibly effective. Harry began to see how often anger was redirected outward, toward institutions, toward family, toward nameless enemies, rarely inward, rarely toward reflection. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw genuine uncertainty expressed? Not pain, not outrage. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is human. It's messy. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't perform. And that's the problem. Because the narrative they were living inside required certainty at all times. Certainty about motives. Certainty about villains. Certainty about victimhood. Harry's emerging uncertainty didn't fit. So it was treated as a threat. The emotional temperature of the relationship began to rise. Not through arguments, but through tension. The kind of tension where every word feels weighted. Where silence feels safer than honesty. Harry started choosing silence. That choice wasn't passive. It was survival. Because each attempt at honest conversation ended the same way, with him apologizing for asking. And apologies accumulate. They change the balance of a relationship. They teach one person to doubt themselves and the other to expect compliance. That's when the loneliness set in. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of not being understood by the person closest to you. Harry had given up his support system, his family, his old life, his sense of place, all for the belief that this relationship was the one space where he could be fully himself. Now, that space felt conditional. Conditional on belief. Conditional on agreement. Conditional on silence. This is where the isolation reached its most dangerous form. Because when you can't talk openly with your partner, you start talking to yourself. And that inner dialogue can be brutal. Am I imagining this? Am I being unfair? Am I betraying her by thinking this way? Harry questioned himself constantly. And that self-questioning delayed action. Which is exactly why this stage of the story lasted so long. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The couple appeared united. Statements were aligned. Appearances were controlled. But internally, Harry was wrestling with a realization that frightened him. He no longer trusted the emotional logic of the relationship. Not the love, not the affection, the logic. Because love without trust becomes obligation. And obligation without freedom becomes resentment. That resentment hadn't exploded yet, but it was building. And then something happened that pushed it past the point of internal conflict. An inconsistency that couldn't be explained away emotionally. A detail that directly contradicted Harry's own memory. A moment where the story required him to deny his lived experience. That's the line. Because once someone asks you to doubt your own memory in order to preserve theirs, the relationship changes forever. Harry didn't confront immediately. He couldn't. The stakes were too high. Instead, he did something quiet. He paid attention. He listened more closely. He noticed patterns. He observed how stories shifted depending on the audience. How emotional emphasis replaced factual clarity. And in doing so, he stumbled onto a realization that terrified him. This wasn't about one lie, or even several. It was about control over reality itself. Who decides what happened? Who decides what matters? Who decides which emotions are valid? Those questions are lethal to a marriage built on narrative unity. Because once you start asking them, you're no longer inside the story. You're outside it. And from the outside, things look very different. Harry began to understand that his role had shifted from partner to proof. His presence validated the story. His loyalty authenticated it. His silence protected it. And the moment he stopped performing that role, even internally, the structure wobbled. That wobble didn't go unnoticed. Tension increased. Emotional appeals intensified. The past was revisited repeatedly as justification for the present. But something had already changed. Harry was no longer absorbing the narrative unquestioningly. He was evaluating it. And evaluation is fatal to control. Because once you see how the pieces fit together, you start noticing what doesn't fit at all. What Harry noticed next wasn't just contradiction. It was strategy. And recognizing strategy where you thought there was only emotion is a kind of awakening that cannot be reversed. But what he uncovered next would force him to choose between maintaining the story and maintaining himself. And that choice would split everything wide open. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when you stop reacting emotionally and start observing structurally? Because that's the moment everything changes. Not loudly. Not publicly. Quietly. Internally. The moment when pain gives way to pattern recognition. Up until now, Harry had been moving inside the story. Feeling it. Defending it. Absorbing it. Living it. Now he was stepping back. And from a distance, something unsettling became clear. The conflicts weren't random. The emotional spikes weren't spontaneous. The pressure points appeared at very specific moments. That's not chaos. That's design. Once you see design, you stop asking who's right and start asking why things happen when they do. Harry began noticing how doubt always triggered the same response cycle. First, emotion, then memory, then sacrifice, then urgency. Each time, the conversation was pulled away from the original question and redirected toward loyalty. Not intentionally malicious, not overtly manipulative, but consistently effective. And consistency is what separates coincidence from strategy. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Not because of what was said, but because of how. Harry began replaying past conversations not for content, but for structure. Who spoke first? Who framed the issue? Who decided what mattered? Who escalated emotion when facts entered the room? The pattern was undeniable. Whenever Harry expressed uncertainty, the narrative expanded outward. External enemies were reintroduced. Past wounds resurfaced. Emotional stakes were raised so high that retreat felt like the only compassionate option. That's not communication. That's containment. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many times can someone redirect a conversation before it stops being dialogue? Harry realized he wasn't being argued with. He was being managed. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. And clarity is dangerous when it arrives quietly, because it doesn't ask for permission. Once he saw the structure, he couldn't unsee it. Every disagreement followed the same arc. Every question led to the same emotional terrain. Every attempt at nuance ended in moral framing. You're either with me or against me. You either believe me or you don't. You either support this or you're betraying us. There was no space in between. And here's the contradiction that haunted him. The public narrative was about breaking free from rigid binaries. about rejecting outdated systems that force people into roles, about complexity and truth and authenticity. Yet privately, the relationship had become binary itself. Agree or harm, support or attack, believe or abandon. That irony cut deep, because Harry didn't feel like an equal participant anymore. He felt like a character required to hit his marks. And once you feel cast instead of chosen, the relationship shifts fundamentally. Harry started testing the system, not confrontationally, subtly. He'd offer alternative interpretations of past events. He'd suggest that two things could be true at once. He'd acknowledge pain while asking for clarity. Each time, the response was immediate and emotional, not reflective, not curious, defensive. And defensiveness tells you where the fault lines are. The more Harry leaned into observation, the more he noticed something else. Timing. The most emotionally intense moments always coincided with moments of potential independence. When Harry spent time thinking on his own, when he reconnected with old perspectives, when he hesitated before committing to a new public position, emotions surged precisely when autonomy appeared. That's not accidental. That's reinforcement. It trains behavior without explicit instruction. Harry began to understand that the relationship had developed its own gravity, a pull toward sameness, toward alignment, toward silence, and resisting that pull felt physically uncomfortable. That discomfort is powerful. It keeps people in place long after logic tells them to move. This is where the isolation reached a new phase, because Harry wasn't just isolated from others. He was isolated from his own interpretive authority. When you stop trusting your ability to assess reality, you become dependent on someone else's version of it. And dependency is fragile. Harry noticed how often he deferred, how frequently he adjusted his tone mid-sentence, how instinctively he checked reactions before finishing a thought. Those aren't signs of fear. They're signs of conditioning. That realization was devastating, because it forced him to confront something he had spent years avoiding. What if the dynamic he thought he escaped had simply changed shape? Different setting, different language, same loss of agency. That question didn't make him angry. It made him quiet. Silence became his refuge. Observation his defense. Distance his only way to think. And that distance created a crack in the structure, because the narrative required constant reinforcement, constant emotional engagement, constant alignment. Harry's withdrawal disrupted that rhythm. He wasn't arguing anymore. He wasn't defending anymore. He was listening. And listening revealed more than confrontation ever could. He noticed how certain grievances resurfaced repeatedly, unchanged, regardless of time or context. How some stories became more vivid with each retelling. How emotional intensity increased instead of resolving. Pain was being preserved, not processed. And preserved pain has a purpose. It justifies behavior. It demands loyalty. It silences dissent. Harry began to understand that the story wasn't moving forward. It was looping. That's when something snapped internally. Because growth requires movement, resolution, change. Loops trap you in the same emotional position forever. Harry didn't want to live in a loop. So he did something radical. He started trusting his memory, not dismissing emotion, not denying pain, but holding his lived experience as valid. That act alone destabilized everything. Because if his memory mattered, then the story had to accommodate it. And it couldn't. That incompatibility became undeniable. Harry realized that the relationship wasn't collapsing because of conflict. It was collapsing because of rigidity. There was no room for reinterpretation, no space for shared uncertainty, no allowance for evolution. Everything had to remain exactly as it was framed, or the structure would fall. And when a structure requires absolute stillness to survive, it's already broken. The realization hit Harry with a wave of grief, so intense it left him numb. Not grief for the relationship alone. Grief for the years spent defending something that now felt hollow. Grief for the family ties severed in its name. Grief for the version of himself who believed loyalty meant silence. That grief didn't explode. It settled. And in that settling, Harry made a quiet decision. He would stop reinforcing the narrative. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Internally. No more automatic agreement. No more emotional shortcuts. No more surrendering his perspective to keep the peace. That decision didn't end the marriage immediately, but it changed the power dynamic irrevocably. Because once one person stops participating in narrative enforcement, the system panics. Emotional intensity spikes. Pressure increases. Stakes are raised. And that's exactly what happened. The responses became sharper. The language more urgent. The reminders of past sacrifice more frequent. But Harry no longer reacted the same way. He didn't escalate. He didn't apologize. He didn't retreat. He stayed still. And stillness is terrifying to someone who relies on emotional motion. That's when the final contradiction emerged. The story claimed to be about truth, but it could not survive scrutiny. The story claimed to be about freedom, but it punished independence. The story claimed to be about love, but it required compliance. Harry saw it clearly now, and seeing it meant he could no longer pretend. The next step wasn't dramatic. It was decisive, because once you reclaim your interpretive authority, you don't argue anymore. You choose. And the choice Harry was moving toward would not just end a marriage. It would expose the story that held it together. But what happened next wasn't a confrontation. It was a moment. A single moment where the narrative collapsed under its own weight and forced Harry to say something he could never take back. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What do you do when the story you've been protecting finally asks you to betray yourself? Because that's the moment Harry was walking toward now. Not sprinting, not collapsing, walking, slowly, with awareness, with dread, with a kind of calm that only arrives when you've already accepted that something is over, even if no one else knows it yet. Up to this point, everything had been internal. Observation, withdrawal, pattern recognition, quiet resistance. But stories like this don't unravel in silence forever. They reach a breaking point. And the breaking point didn't come during an argument. It didn't come during a public appearance. It didn't come under the glare of cameras or in the heat of a headline. It came in a moment so ordinary that it almost didn't register as dangerous at first. A conversation, a detail, a correction. That's all it took. Because the most devastating lies aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that force you to deny your own memory in real time. The moment unfolded without drama. No raised voices. No tears. Just a simple exchange about something that had happened, something Harry knew he had experienced firsthand. A recollection was shared. A version was stated. And Harry realized it wasn't right. Not emotionally wrong. Not interpretively wrong. Factually wrong. Dates didn't line up. Context didn't match. The sequence of events was altered just enough to change responsibility, motive, meaning. Harry hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Because in the past, he would have filled the gap himself. He would have adjusted his memory. He would have assumed his perception was flawed. This time, he didn't. He paused. He replayed the moment in his head. He checked it against his own experience. And then he said something simple. That's not how I remember it. Those words weren't an accusation. They weren't aggressive. They were tentative, careful, almost apologetic. But they landed like a grenade. The response was immediate. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Not reconsideration. Emotion. Hurt. Shock. Offense. How could you say that? Why would you question me? Why does it matter how you remember it? And that's when it happened. That's when Harry felt the floor drop. Because the reaction wasn't about resolving a discrepancy. It was about shutting it down. And in that instant, Harry understood something that cannot be ununderstood. The truth was less important than the version. That realization is a kind of violence. It doesn't bruise the skin. It fractures trust. Harry didn't argue. He didn't push. He didn't escalate. He listened. And as he listened, the explanation shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. A detail softened here. A justification appeared there. The emotional framing intensified as the factual clarity dissolved. It was happening again. The same pattern. Emotion over explanation. Urgency over accuracy. Loyalty over truth. But this time, Harry wasn't inside it. He was watching it. And watching it stripped it of its power. Because when you're no longer emotionally hooked, you can see the mechanics at work. He noticed how quickly the conversation moved away from the actual discrepancy and toward the implications of his doubt. How his question was reframed as an attack. How his memory was positioned as a threat to safety, trust, unity. That reframing is critical. Because once a question becomes a moral failure, the answer no longer matters. Harry realized then that this wasn't about one moment or one story. It was about authority. Who had the authority to define reality inside the relationship? For years, Harry had ceded that authority without realizing it. He trusted. He deferred. He aligned. Now he was reclaiming it. And reclaiming authority always provokes resistance. The conversation ended without resolution. Not because it couldn't be resolved, but because resolution would have required admitting uncertainty. And uncertainty was not permitted. Harry walked away from that moment feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. Not relief. Not freedom. Clarity. The clarity that comes when you finally accept that the problem isn't miscommunication. It's incompatibility at the level of truth. That night, Harry didn't sleep. Not because he was upset, because he was thinking. He replayed years of moments through this new lens. Interviews, statements, private conversations, the language used, the emotional cues, the strategic timing. It all rearranged itself. Things that once felt confusing now felt obvious. The story wasn't collapsing because it was false. It was collapsing because it was rigid. And rigid stories break under pressure. Harry realized something else that night. Something even more unsettling. He hadn't just been defending the story to the world. He had been defending it to himself. That's why the realization hurt so much. Because if the story didn't hold, then the sacrifices he made needed re-examination. The family he lost. The relationships burned. The identity he reshaped. Those weren't abstract losses. They were permanent. And accepting that they may have been shaped by a narrative he didn't fully control was almost unbearable. So Harry did what people do when reality becomes too heavy. He compartmentalized. He didn't confront. He didn't accuse. He didn't announce anything. He gathered information. Quietly, he revisited timelines, compared interviews, noted discrepancies, looked for evolution versus contradiction. What he found wasn't a smoking gun. It was a pattern of adjustment. Details that changed to fit context. Stories that sharpened over time. Motives that grew clearer the further away they got. That doesn't automatically mean deception, but it does mean construction. And construction requires maintenance. Harry began to see how much effort it took to keep the story intact. How often emotional intensity was used to reinforce belief. How disagreement was framed as betrayal. And that's when he asked himself the question that sealed everything. If this story is true, why does it need so much protection? Truth doesn't panic when questioned. Truth doesn't require alignment. Truth doesn't collapse when someone remembers something differently. Harry realized that his role had become essential not because of love, but because of validation. His presence authenticated the narrative. His loyalty sustained it. His silence protected it. And the moment he stopped playing that role internally, the structure wobbled. The pressure intensified after that conversation. Not outwardly, subtly. More emotional appeals. More reminders of shared sacrifice. More urgency around unity. But Harry didn't respond the same way. He didn't push back. He didn't comply. He observed. And observation changed everything. Because he began to see that the relationship had stopped being about mutual understanding and had become about maintaining a position. That's not a marriage. That's a campaign. The realization hit him with a wave of sadness so deep it almost knocked the breath out of him. Not anger. Sadness. Sadness for the love that had been real. Sadness for the hope that had fueled it. Sadness for the version of himself who believed love required unquestioning alignment. Harry knew then that the marriage couldn't survive this awareness. Not because of malice. Because of truth. Because once you reclaim your right to your own memory, your own interpretation, your own inner authority, you can't give it back. The next step wasn't explosive. It was preparatory. Harry began emotionally disengaging from the narrative. Not from the person. From the story. He stopped volunteering defenses. Stopped amplifying claims. Stopped filling in gaps. And that withdrawal was noticed. Because systems built on reinforcement react badly to absence. Tension increased. Questions turned sharper. Language turned more urgent. But Harry stayed grounded. Because he wasn't fighting anymore. He was leaving. Not physically. Not yet. Psychologically. And once someone leaves psychologically, everything else is just timing. The moment that forced the issue didn't come from Harry. It came from the story itself. A public statement. A repeated claim. A version of events Harry now knew didn't match his experience. That was the moment of no return. Because supporting it would require him to lie. Not just publicly, but internally. And for the first time in years, Harry chose himself. He didn't explode. He didn't threaten. He didn't dramatize. He said something quiet. Something devastating. I can't say that anymore. That sentence didn't end the marriage on paper, but it ended it in reality. Because when the narrative breaks, everything holding it together falls with it. And what followed wasn't reconciliation. It was damage control. And that's when the story moved out of the private realm and into something far more dangerous. Because once narratives fracture internally, they leak externally. And the next phase would involve lawyers, silence, and a reckoning neither of them could control. But the most shocking part? The public had no idea it had already begun. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens after the story breaks, but before anyone knows it's broken? Because that space is the most dangerous part of all. The limbo. The waiting room between private collapse and public revelation. The period where everything looks normal from the outside while the foundations are already gone. That's where Harry was now. The moment he said, "I can't say that anymore," something fundamental shifted. Not just in the marriage, in the power structure around it. Because for the first time, the narrative no longer had unanimous consent. And narratives without consent don't just weaken. They retaliate. At first, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting. No threats. No ultimatums. That's how you know something serious has begun. When the noise disappears and calculation replaces emotion. The atmosphere changed. Conversations became shorter, more formal, less emotional, but more strategic. Words were chosen carefully. Silences stretched longer. Eye contact lingered just a second too long, as if both sides were measuring something unspoken. Harry felt it immediately. This wasn't about resolving a disagreement anymore. This was about containment. Because once someone refuses to reinforce a shared story, the priority shifts from persuasion to control. Not necessarily in a malicious way, but in a self-preserving one. And the story needed preservation. Harry began noticing how quickly topics changed when they drifted toward certain details. How conversations were steered away from specifics and toward feelings. How reminders of shared sacrifice were reintroduced with new urgency. You remember what we went through. You remember what we lost. You remember why this matters. Those phrases returned like anchors, dropped repeatedly to keep the conversation from drifting too far. But Harry didn't grab onto them this time. He listened, and listening revealed something else. The fear. Because beneath the composure, beneath the emotional appeals, there was fear. Not of abandonment. Not of divorce. Fear of exposure. Not exposure in the tabloid sense. Not scandal. Exposure of the structure. Because once Harry stopped reinforcing the narrative, the story no longer had its most powerful validator. His credibility. His sacrifice. His bloodline. Without him, the story didn't collapse immediately, but it lost its authority. That's when the language around unity intensified. We need to stay aligned. This isn't the time to question things. People are watching. Alignment. That word matters. Alignment isn't about truth. It's about direction. And Harry realized he was being asked not to tell the truth, but to maintain direction. That request crossed a line he could no longer step back over. He didn't say that out loud. Not yet. Instead, he did something even more destabilizing. He stopped participating in future planning. No more enthusiastic discussions about upcoming appearances. No more collaborative messaging. No more rehearsing answers. He became passive. And passivity is dangerous to systems built on momentum. Momentum requires constant energy, constant reinforcement, constant belief. Harry's withdrawal created drag, and drag invites scrutiny. Behind the scenes, according to people familiar with the situation, the tone shifted from emotional to logistical. Schedules, legalities, boundaries, not divorce, preparation. Because when stories fracture, the people inside them don't always rush to end things. They rush to protect themselves. Harry felt the walls going up. Not visibly, subtly. Access changed. Conversations became mediated. Advisors appeared where intimacy used to be. Language became careful, almost corporate. That's when Harry understood something critical. The marriage had entered a new phase. Not reconciliation, not conflict, but negotiation. And negotiation between spouses only happens when the assumption of shared truth is gone. Harry wasn't angry about it. He was saddened. Because negotiation means the relationship has moved out of the emotional realm and into the strategic one. It means trust has been replaced by risk management. Harry began to feel like a liability instead of a partner. Every word he spoke was weighed. Every hesitation noticed. Every silence interpreted. That awareness changes how you move through your own life. He became more guarded, more introspective, more careful, not because he was plotting, but because he was being observed. And observation creates distance. Harry found himself thinking less about what he felt and more about how his reactions might be interpreted. That's when he realized something else had been lost. Safety. A marriage without safety isn't a marriage. It's an arrangement. And arrangements end. But endings don't happen all at once. They unfold, quietly at first. Harry noticed how public statements began to sound less unified, how phrasing subtly shifted, how certain details were emphasized while others disappeared. Nothing obvious, nothing a casual observer would catch. But Harry caught it, because now he was listening like someone who no longer belonged inside the story. And from the outside, the edits were obvious. He began recognizing language that wasn't meant for him anymore. Language designed to stand on its own, to survive without his reinforcement. That's when he understood the next truth. The narrative was preparing to continue without him. And that realization hurt more than anything else, because it confirmed what he had already sensed. The story mattered more than the relationship. Harry didn't confront that realization directly. He internalized it. And in doing so, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would no longer protect the story at the expense of himself. Not actively, not aggressively, but definitively. That decision didn't come with a declaration. It came with restraint. Harry stopped correcting things privately, stopped pushing for alignment, stopped asking for explanations. He let the narrative speak for itself. And when you do that, contradictions become louder. Because without active reinforcement, stories reveal their weak points. Harry noticed how often claims were repeated instead of clarified, how emotional intensity increased where factual detail should have lived, how urgency replaced coherence. Those aren't signs of confidence. They're signs of strain. Harry felt the pressure building. Not outward pressure, inward. The weight of knowing that whatever came next would be irreversible. Because once the public rupture happened, there would be no neutral ground, no shared version of events, no quiet resolution. Everything would be interpreted, weaponized, framed. Harry knew that staying silent forever wasn't an option. Silence would be interpreted as consent, and consent would make him complicit in a story he no longer believed. That's the crossroads. Do you preserve peace by betraying yourself? Or do you risk chaos to preserve your integrity? Harry had spent years choosing peace. This time, he chose integrity. The shift wasn't announced. It was enacted. He began quietly separating himself from shared messaging, declining certain appearances, limiting statements, creating distance that could later be explained as scheduling, stress, privacy. To the public, nothing looked wrong. To those watching closely, everything looked different. The warmth was gone. The ease was gone. What remained was formality. And formality is the last stop before separation. Harry knew that the next phase would not be emotional. It would be legal. And legal phases don't begin with declarations. They begin with documentation, boundaries, records, advisors. Harry began preparing, not to attack, not to expose, but to survive what was coming. Because he understood something crucial now. Once narratives fracture, someone always tries to control the ending. And the ending was approaching faster than anyone realized. The public would be told a version. The press would speculate. Supporters would pick sides. But the truth, the real truth, would be buried somewhere between what was said and what was avoided. Harry didn't know yet how much of that truth would ever surface. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back. The marriage was no longer a shared reality. It was two competing interpretations occupying the same space. And that space was collapsing. The final straw wouldn't be a fight. It would be a decision. A choice made quietly, legally, irrevocably. And when that choice was revealed, it would shock everyone who believed the story was still intact. Because by the time the world noticed, it would already be over. But what came next wouldn't just end a marriage. It would ignite a battle over truth, credibility, and control, one that would spill far beyond the relationship itself. And the first move in that battle was already underway. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when preparation turns into action? Because there's a quiet line between planning for the worst and accepting that the worst is inevitable. Harry crossed that line without ceremony. No announcement. No dramatic confrontation. Just a shift in behavior that, to anyone who understood the signals, meant one thing. This was no longer about fixing anything. It was about ending it. From the outside, nothing looked different. Schedules still existed. Public language remained carefully neutral. The image of unity was technically intact, but behind the scenes, the machinery had changed. When relationships move from emotional management to procedural management, something irreversible has already happened. Lawyers don't appear because people are angry. They appear because people are done. Harry didn't arrive at that point impulsively. He arrived there through exhaustion. Exhaustion from holding a narrative together with his own credibility. Exhaustion from managing emotional reactions that escalated whenever clarity was requested. Exhaustion from being the stabilizing force in a story that refused to stabilize. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Ending something like this doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like grief layered with fear. Because walking away doesn't just mean losing a partner. It means losing the version of yourself who believed in the story completely. Harry understood that the moment he moved forward, there would be consequences that could never be undone. The public would speculate. The press would choose sides. Every word he'd ever said would be replayed, dissected, reinterpreted. But staying meant something worse. It meant continuing to lend his voice to something he no longer trusted. And that is a slow death. So the shift began. Not with a public statement. With boundaries. Harry stopped sharing internal doubts. Stopped participating in narrative rehearsals. Stopped pre-approving language that framed reality in ways he couldn't stand behind anymore. Those absences were noticed immediately. Because systems built on cooperation feel withdrawal like betrayal. The response wasn't explosive. It was strategic. Tone shifted. Communication became mediated. Conversations were increasingly filtered through advisors. Language became careful, almost legal. That's when Harry knew this was no longer a marriage problem. It was a separation in progress. And separation doesn't begin with moving out. It begins with positioning. Who says what? Who speaks when? Who controls the framing of the ending? Harry realized that if he didn't act deliberately, the narrative would act for him. And narratives don't care about fairness. They care about survival. The first concrete step wasn't dramatic. It was documentation. Harry began recording timelines, saving messages, clarifying his own memory against written records, not to build a case against anyone, but to preserve his own reality. Because when stories fracture, memory becomes a battlefield, and whoever controls the record controls the aftermath. Harry had learned that lesson too late once already. He wasn't going to repeat it. This period was one of intense internal conflict. Not because Harry was unsure of his decision, but because he understood the emotional cost of executing it. Ending a marriage built on shared opposition isn't just about two people. It's about undoing an identity. For years, Harry had been part of a unit defined by its defiance. Against the press, against the institution, against anyone who questioned the story. Walking away meant disentangling himself from that posture. It meant standing alone again. And that terrified him. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he knew how ruthless public reinterpretation could be. Every past interview would be reframed. Every statement scrutinized. Every silence filled in by speculation. Harry knew that once the split became public, there would be a race to define the meaning of it. Was he abandoning her? Was he betraying the cause? Was he being manipulated now by someone else? Those questions were inevitable, and that's why timing mattered. Harry didn't want a dramatic reveal. He wanted a controlled exit, one that minimized collateral damage and maximized clarity. But clarity is hard when narratives are already entrenched. This is where the story becomes especially complicated. Because while Harry was pulling away internally, the public-facing narrative was still operating on inertia. Statements were still being released. Claims still repeated. Emotional framing still applied. And with each repetition, Harry felt the pressure increase. Because silence in the face of repetition becomes implication. People assume agreement. That assumption weighed on him heavily. There were moments when Harry considered breaking the silence immediately, speaking openly, correcting the record, reclaiming his voice. But he understood the risk. Speaking too early would escalate everything. It would turn a private separation into a public war. It would force positions to harden before any resolution could be negotiated. So he waited, not passively, deliberately. He focused on building a foundation that could support him once the narrative inevitably shifted. That meant reconnecting with perspectives he had previously cut off, not necessarily reconciling, listening. It meant revisiting family dynamics with a new lens, not to assign blame, but to understand how he'd arrived where he was. It meant acknowledging his own role in amplifying a story he now questioned. That self-awareness hurt, because it required humility. It required admitting that loyalty had clouded judgment. That emotional alignment had replaced critical thinking. Harry didn't frame himself as a victim in this process. He framed himself as responsible.